1950s were a time of change and reformation as a whole after the war, after World War II. TV became a staple in the 1950s, and European cinema became popular since it wasn't banned anymore due to the war. Society became more domestic as a whole, and the stereotypical 50s dress was true, such as jeans and crew cuts for men and ponytails and poodle skirts for girls. Women loved Christian Dior and Chanel, and women dressed very femininely, which led to rebellion in teens, thanks to James Dean and Marilyn Monroe. Since suburbia was flourishing, the teens tried to go against it.
One of the most important movements of the 1950s was the Civil Rights Movement, led by Martin Luther King Jr. This movement was to get rid of the segregation between African American and white citizens. In many places there would be colored areas and white areas because the white people viewed the African Americans as animals. The first anti-segregation act was by Rosa Parks when she decided not to move to the back of the bus for a white citizen. This led to the Montgomery bus boycott, and soon desegregation was happening all over America in places such as the Little Rock School. This led to many white supremacist fights. Another important discovery of the 1950s was the discovery of DNA and the discovery of the polio vaccine by Jonas Salk. This helped many children with disabilities. One of the biggest problems of the 1950s, however, was the Soviet scare. The Cold War had just started, and many people were scared that communism would take over in America. This led to the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were committed of giving Soviet spies information about the U.S. atomic bomb. They were later executed because of this.
In the 1950s, women were just beginning to express their style. They moved away from military styles into more carefree ones. Although they were advised by the government to be more conservative in the amount of fabric used, women dressed in styles by Christian Dior that included form-fitting dresses and calf-length skirts. High heels also became more popular during this time to give women a feeling of femininity. Women often wore bright colors to show their carefree attitude. Girls' hairstyles were very short in style. They had styles like the flip, the beehive, the bouffant, and the French twist that they would wear around the house or to go out. Men during this time were much like what you would see in the movie Grease. They wore jeans, white t-shirts, and leather jackets. Crew cuts were very popular during this time, but towards the mid-50s, boys began styling in pompadours, much like Elvis Presley.
In the 1950s society, the women are expected to not only deal with their own problems, but they have to deal with their husbands as well, even with something as simple as constipation. Although the women had the male problems on their hand, the man was still the dominant figure in the household. Smoking was very popular in the 1950s, and the people of the decade were obviously not aware of the dangers, considering they promoted their brands with babies, and they said that there would be no side effects like throat irritation, which in today's society we know is untrue.
In the 1950s, there were many different activities that boys and girls had to fill their time. Things like the Barbie doll, Mr. Potato Head, yo-yo, and the hula hoop all came out during this time. These were mostly entertainment for children or families, so adults and teenagers began going to drive-in theaters or dancing. Dancing was one of the most popular activities for dates to get away from their families and have some fun. Although those were all a big hit, the television was the best entertainment this time had. Since it was just invented, there were not many shows broadcast, but it was still a great time for families to have fun all together.
There were many odd behaviors that emerged in the 1950s, including panty raids, which were when men in universities marched into the women's dorm rooms to steal the women's lingerie. This expressed their need to rebel. They also began to find interest in stuffing as many people as quickly as possible into small areas, such as telephone booths or even cars. They would have competitions to see who could fit more people into these areas in the quickest amount of time. Beatniks presented themselves in the 1950s, and these boys and girls were the pre-hippies. They wore plain, dark, loose-fitting clothing, and they didn't want to work at all. They often expressed their rebellion by going against the war and advocating for peace.
Music in the 1950s was very similar to music in the 1940s. Big band and swing music was still very popular, and doo-wop became very big as a genre. Rock and roll emerged in the mid-1950s with Elvis as the big breakout star, and it evolved from blues and was heavily influenced by R&B music. And Elvis was easily the biggest cultural icon of the 50s. Country also became relatively popular, and rockabilly emerged as a genre. Buddy Holly was also a big musician in the 1950s, and him and Richie Valens and the Big Bopper died in a plane crash, which was known as the day that music died. Dancing also became popular as rock and roll became more popular, and it became a way for teenagers to rebel against the perfect suburban society.
Marilyn Monroe was one of the major sex symbols in the 1950s. She starred in many big movies during the 50s. One of the bigger movies was Some Like It Hot. Along with being a major movie star, she was also a role model to many teens that wanted to be just like her. Another female sex symbol was Elizabeth Taylor. She took part in the earlier version of The Father of the Bride that ran in the 1950s. The ironic thing about this is that she had been married 8 times to 7 different men. James Dean was the male sex symbol. He partook in many movies, but the biggest one he partook in was The East of Eden. One big show that aired during the 50s was the Mickey Mouse Club. It had the same purpose as the Mickey Mouse Club now, but instead of cartoon characters, it was played by teenagers. The show I Love Lucy stars Lucille Ball, and in this show she goes out and tries to do a man's job, and all she does is screw up everything.
132! On behalf of our tubby trio, I welcome you to our flabby foursome.
2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around 6 o'clock tonight. Right, down. Join me, hi. We'll have